Hello, as you may all know, I'm Eddie, and the country that I chose to be talking about today is China, specifically on the subject of climate change. The reason that I chose to talk about China was because of its mass population and major lead in production at a global scale. Even more in depth, I will be talking about how the Chinese population density is indirectly correlated with climate change. I chose to go in depth into climate change because it is a real global problem, but it isn't treated as one and sometimes even pushed back by politics. We all know that the amount of energy use is dependent on the amount of people. This means that as the amount of people, in other words, as the population increases, the amount of energy use will most likely follow a similar trend line. Since China is currently one of the most highly populated countries, the demand for energy will be a lot greater than another country like Chad, for example. After this, I created my claim, which was the human population demand more energy usage to keep up with the exponential growing population, which leads to energy sources that pollute the air and cause higher carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Since China is constantly growing at an exponential rate, more energy producing sources have to be set to meet the demand, which ultimately leads to the climate change issue. One solution, although being inconsistent and dependent on weather patterns, are renewable sources, which are always being brought up. But only 12.4% of the total energy consumption in China is coming from these renewable sources back in 2015. This means that these renewable sources of energy aren't being taken advantage of, which can further our problem with climate change. However, we have to take into account that one trade off of these renewable sources are just not enough to keep up with the massive population in China, which is why coal power plants are preferred because of its greater energy output when compared to renewable sources that can produce and can compete with those coal power sources producing like 10 times more energy. So going further into China's demographic charts, I learned many things, even one that can counter this trade-off. The majority of middle-aged people is what's the majority of the population are middle-aged people and elderlies. As these older people pass away and the bottom half of the graph, which is shown right here, grows up in the future years. So as these people pass away, the bottom half of the graph will be the new population of China, this part right here, which is a lot smaller than this long curve right here that we have of the China's current population. The graph to the right shows a better representation of the predictions for the upcoming years of China's population. As you can see, the slope of the graph starts to decrease, but only one of those lines goes up. This line is predicting that if birth rate goes up by 0.5, then population will continue to increase. China's population will start to decrease in the upcoming years, especially because of this new pandemic. However, this doesn't mean that the climate change problem will solve itself. My counterclaim is that as the population starts to decrease, it would be very advantageous to help us slow down the climate change issue. However, we need to start implementing these new renewable sources of energy and advancing in technology during the period of population drop, which is in the further years shown in this graph. One common misconception is that climate change is caused primarily by the sun. However, this is not entirely true because even though the sun does transmit heat into our atmosphere, that same heat is being released back outside the atmosphere. But because of these high concentrations and emissions of carbon dioxide in the air and greenhouse gases, these molecules trap the heat, which keeps it from being released back out. Since we see potential decline in China's exponential growth, This can ultimately help us slow down the progress of climate change in the long run. However, this will happen in an indirect way. When the population starts to decrease and go down, the amount of energy use will as a result go down as well. The result This will result in the 84.6% of the non-renewable sources of energy to produce less energy to meet with the demand for less people in China. Less output of energy in favor results in less carbon emissions. And less carbon emissions result in the slowing of climate change. Since we can't offer an immediate solution to this issue, over time and according to Chinese population demographics, we would be able to see a potential reduction in the amount of energy used per capita. And for the end of this presentation, I want to ask the audience a question, which is of what I've just presented. My question is, how can we see a reduction of the climate change pace? My proposed answer is that with time, as the population starts to decrease in China, automatically we can use this time to advance in new renewable sources of energy so that so that when time comes when the population eventually is exponentially growing again, we can see a decline of our carbon footprint. Thank you.